Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. We're going to be talking about horror today, one of my favorite topics, and the reason we are doing so is this week has been a bit unusual. Even though we are nowhere near Halloween, which is where these games usually come out, the two biggest games of the week, in terms of quality anyway, have both been horror themed. One is Project Zero, Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, or if you're in the US, it's Fatal Frame, Mask of the Lunar Eclipse. And this is Koei Tecmo's latest game in the series. I say latest, it is actually an older game. It was a Wii original that has been remastered, but we never got the Wii original. This one had not been localized until now. So we are playing it for the first time, and it is very, very good. The other one is Paranormasight, The Seven Mysteries of Honjo, which is a Square Enix visual novel, which is unusual in itself, but it is kind of a death game horror thing, a little bit like, I guess, Danganronpa, just really dark, or Squid Game, or, that kind of genre of storytelling mixed in with a very horror style approach to what happens to the characters when they fail and stuff. It is very, very good as well. I highly recommend you check that one out, even though it is not going to be Square Enix's biggest game this year. Certainly Final Fantasy 16 is going to outsell it, even if Final Fantasy 16 is not a good game, and this one is very good. But if you do like your visual novels, if you like your horror, if you like your quality storytelling, then I recommend you check that one out as well. I have reviews of both of those games on digitally-downloaded.net, and I do recommend you check them out. I'm not going to be talking about the games themselves in this video. Rather, what I want to use this video to do is talk about the difference between Western horror and Japanese horror. Both of these games that were released this week are Japanese horror games. And from the responses that I've seen to them, some of the reviews and analysis that I've seen, I do see a bit of a misconception, I guess, out there about Japanese horror, and an assumption, I think, that it is trying to be like Western horror, that, Project Zero is, people were comparing Project Zero to the likes of Resident Evil and other horror games. So I wanted to use this video to kind of clarify that, because Japanese horror and Western horror are very, very different things, and I don't think it's necessarily fair to try and compare them. And something to note about it is that it is very cultural. So Western horror is, generally speaking, about posing some kind of existential threat to the characters, the protagonists, and we're meant to empathize with those characters. So whether that is, to talk about the kind of the dumb end of the horror, the slasher genre, where you've got some kind of monster like Jason or Freddy or Michael, who is out to get a bunch of idiot people who are being idiots, and their goal is to survive, and usually only one or two do, and that leads to kind of a final physical confrontation with those characters. That's an example of Western horror. Another one would be The Exorcist, where you've got this quite smart battle between spirituality and a test of faith, kind of a metaphor for the priest as he tries to exorcise the demon that's within the young girl. There is plenty of scope for that concept to be applied to a whole wide range of horror. Another example would be It, where a lot of the prejudices and fears of the town of that Stephen King's story is set in have manifested as this creature, which then goes and hunts young people, and then their battle against it to try and banish it to the cosmos, because it ends up being quite Lovecraftian at the end of it. So it can be quite smart, it can be quite philosophical, it can be quite intellectually engaging, but the general idea is that there is a monster out there. Your goal is to survive it, and your goal being the protagonists, and we as the audience are very much incentivized to relate to those protagonists. Japanese horror, on the other hand, is generally speaking about some kind of tragedy, and the tragedy is where our empathies are meant to lie. So something horrible has happened at some point, which has produced perhaps a monster, and that monster is the manifestation of the consequences of the tragedy. And then we as the audience are meant to empathize as much with that monster as such as the protagonists that are trying to survive the murderous rampage. And I can give you a good example of that. The Ring, particularly the book, which is kind of the actual story, but also the Japanese adaptation of it into a film. The Ring is very much the horror of The Ring is very much found within the sadness of the story about what happens to Sadako, the girl that becomes the ghost that climbs out of TVs to kill people. And while we do also empathize with the victims of Ghost to Sadako, really we're meant to empathize strongly with Sadako, and the fear, the horror, the tension of the story is as much wrapped up in learning about that tragedy as anything else. It also applies to The Grudge, which is, or Ju-on, as it's known in Japan. And that's an interesting example because the filmmaker that made Ju-on also produced the American version of The Grudge. So we can actually see where he has deliberately changed things to try to make the original story, which is also very kind of tragic and evocative and emotional in tone, into a monster story for the Western audience. And they are very different as a result. You can watch the Japanese Ju-on, sorry. You can watch Japanese Ju-on and then you can watch the American Grudge, and you'll have a very different horror experience that is very, very different in tone, in texture, in the response that you have to it, and how much you can therefore enjoy it. Now, I'm not saying either is better or worse. Some would probably prefer the American version. I personally prefer the Japanese version because I'm much more about that storytelling style, but they're definitely different is the point. And the same difference can be seen in video games as well. Project Zero in particular, yes, you're playing as a protagonist who is trying to survive an onslaught of ghosts in a haunted location. But in the process, you learn about that haunted location and you learn about how it has come to be. And inevitably, it is a very sorrowful story. It is one that you are meant to feel very emotionally connected to and feel the tragedy that is unfurled there. So even though you're trying to survive it, at the same time, you're very sympathetic towards it. Paranormasight is much the same, in that where a lot of Western games rely on jump scares and gore and other visceral elements to emphasize the physical threat and the existential monster that kind of exists out there that is coming to get people, in Paranormasight, there isn't much blood. You do see characters that are dead, but really they're just kind of withered husks from the cursed claiming their souls. And instead, the story is very much about this kind of tragedy of all these people being put into this mortal conflict with one another, because it is person to person. The curses, which is what takes your soul in Paranormasight, without trying to explain the entire game here, each of these characters are in possession of a curse, and that curse can be used to take the life of other people that are cursed. And so they're kind of enticed into this combat with one another to see who can collect the most souls and kill the most of their rival players. And that is a tragedy. Each of these characters has a very positive story in their own way. They're not horrible people. They're not monsters. The situation is a tragedy, and it is terrifying in that way, but it's not terrifying because there is some monster coming to get people. It's just terrifying because it's a horrible situation, and it is one that you are meant to emotionally connect with. So this is a very big difference between Japanese horror and Western horror. What it means is that Japanese horror tends to be quite subtle. It has a very slow build. It tends to be quite intense in atmosphere and tone, but very limited in terms of jump scares. And because it doesn't have the visceral bloodletting and the extreme agony kind of being depicted on screen, it can come across as a little bit too subtle, I guess. And it doesn't tend to do well anywhere but Japan and perhaps the rest of Asia. I don't know how well Japanese horror does into the rest of Asia, but it is kind of a cultural thing that means that it doesn't really sell to other cultures, which is why for films like The Ring or Grudge, when it comes time to do an American version, they try to westernize it so it can be more appealing to a global audience. And in doing so, they try and make it into kind of a more monster-based story. And the same goes for video games. You know, when a company wants to try and make money from horror, they'll generally try to tap into Western horror techniques and styles, which is why Resident Evil has done so well, and even Silent Hill has kind of done so well, because it has managed to maintain sales and find a way of keeping a Western audience whereas Project Zero has nearly died multiple times, the reason being it is perhaps a bit subtle. And when you read through the reviews of Project Zero, you will see that. You will see that there are people that don't quite connect with it because it doesn't have the visceral activity, the action, the excitement of these Western-style horror games. So anyway, I thought this might be an interesting video to talk about. Do let me know your own thoughts in the comments. I mean, if you are a fan of Western horror over Japanese horror, let me know why. Let's have a good discussion about that. I'm certainly not suggesting that my personal position that Japanese horror is more enjoyable is a universal truth, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you are wrong if you prefer Western horror, but do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a chat about that. If you've enjoyed this video and you want to see more of them, be sure to like and subscribe, because by doing so you'll see it pop up in your feed the next time I upload one. And if you want to support what we're doing on Digitally Downloaded, not just here on the YouTube channel, but also on the website where we publish so many reviews and articles every week, and we go quite in depth with it, and we do try to be interesting and different. If you do think that that is worth supporting and you want to support independent games media, then we do have a Patreon which you can back. The details are in the description box below this video, and you can back us for any amount, $1 a month if you just want to support us, or more if you're feeling generous. That will be certainly appreciated as well. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great weekend. Do play these games. Whatever you think of this video, check out my review of both of those games, because they are excellent, excellent games, and definitely worth your time. And yeah, it is going to be interesting to see what they have come out at Halloween now, because we've kind of already had it. Thanks very, very much, everybody. See you next time.